Is your magic meter running low? Well, we've got a cure for you. Welcome to Disney Coast to Coast.
Hey folks, and welcome to Disney Coast to Coast, the ultimate unofficial Disney fan podcast. I'm Jeff DePauli, and today on the show, I'm speaking with Don Iwerks, who is the son of Disney legend Ub Iwerks. Don has written a book about his dad called Walt Disney's Ultimate Inventor, The Genius of Ub Iwerks. Now, a lot of Disney fans may know about Ub's involvement with the creation of Mickey Mouse or his work on the multiplane camera, but there is so much more to his story. You can learn more about him in my conversation with Don Iwerks coming your way right after this. Honey, time has shrunk away and I didn't grab my Zelensky Labs face mask. That's what you'll be saying if you don't pause this episode right now and head over to whositswhatsits.com to order your Zelensky Labs face mask inspired by the fantastic Walt Disney picture, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. The day of this episode's release, Wednesday, November 18th, 2020, is the last day to order your face mask. So don't miss this opportunity. Visit whositswhatsits.com, spelled like whositswhatsits.com, or click on the link in this episode's description. You don't want to miss this. So hit pause now. I'll be here waiting for you after you come back from ordering.
Prepare for some insight. You've tuned in to an exclusive DCTC interview.
Hello, Don, and welcome to Disney Coast to Coast. Thank you so much for being here tonight.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, now, a lot of people, anybody who's been studying the history of the Walt Disney Company for some time, they most likely know the name Ub Iwerks. And most of us, I'd say, probably immediately think about his huge influence on the creation of Mickey Mouse. But there is so much more. And your book, Walt Disney's Ultimate Inventor, The Genius of Ub Iwerks, does a fantastic job sharing the history. So I want to know, when did the idea for this book come about, and how long of a process was it for you?
A number of years, I tried to get my dad to write a book, and he kept saying, well, I've got time. There's too many other things to do. And I kept putting it off. And it was, I was working in the around 2005, working on the Walt Disney Family Museum in San Francisco, along with Diane Disney Miller. And I had prepared a small booklet for her to describe some of the artifacts that my dad had invented that we were borrowing from the studio for display. And I was in the process of refurbishing those and those various artifacts. But I knew that she probably would not know what they were, so I wrote this little 15-page booklet. Well, she was really impressed and said, oh, this is wonderful. If you could expand this a little bit, you could write a book, we'll sell it in our bookstore. So I thought, well, I really better start writing while I can still remember a lot of this detail. So I would say it was around 2007. So it took all that time, off and on, up to 2019 when it was published by Disney Editions.
Wow. So quite a long time. And you mentioned, you wanted to get this done while you remembered it. And so I was going to ask, was a lot of this your memory, or was a lot of this like Walt Disney Archives research?
Well, really not much, because you see, a lot of the early history had been written by other authors, including my daughter Leslie, who wrote a book called The Hand Behind the Mouse, which chronicled those early days. My goal was to write about the things that I knew about when working with him, from a period of about 1950 up to 1971 when he passed away.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible. I mean, his story is incredible. Let's just start at the beginning, because, I mean, it's crazy to think that Walt Disney and your dad were childhood friends, and what they went on to accomplish was quite incredible. They went into business together at a pretty young age with, Iwerks Disney, and it wasn't the greatest hit, but eventually they got it right with Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. And one of the things I found interesting that you write about in your book is, Disney fans know this story of how Oswald was essentially taken from Walt and your dad, and they had nothing that they could do about it contractually. But your dad even warned Walt about his animators being taken away from him. Your dad was aware of some stuff going on behind the scenes, wasn't he?
That's what I've read. He's never spent any time telling me about those olden days because as far as he was concerned, that's all history. And let's concentrate on what's going on today and tomorrow.
Obviously, Mickey Mouse is one of the most iconic characters in entertainment history. And your dad had a huge part when it comes to the creation of Mickey Mouse. And there's a quote from your dad that's because, a lot of people, I think, would assume, and I feel like I don't know when the Walt Disney Company started talking about Ub Iwerks and his hand in the creation of Mickey, but I don't feel like I grew up hearing about that so much. And at some point that changed where Ub got the recognition he deserved. And there's a quote from him saying, "It isn't creating, it's what you do with it." And Walt Disney did something with it. And it's just like such a beautiful sentiment. It's egoless. And I'm curious, like, does that just feel like it's kind of hard to believe that that's how he truly felt about that? I'm curious if you ever heard anything other than that, or if that's really how he felt about Mickey.
Well, no, that's how he felt. He's very honest and straightforward. He didn't promote Mickey. He drew with him originally, and their first sound cartoon was a big hit, Steamboat Willie, and went on. But after my dad left the studio in 1930, Walt took Mickey and with other animators and took it to where it was. So when someone would ask him, "Aren't you upset about the fact that Walt gets all the credit for Mickey Mouse?" And what you just said is what he said. It isn't the creation that's so important, it's what you do with it after you've created it. And Walt did something with it. So he wasn't about to step in and take Walt's glory away from him.
I feel like most people would hold a grudge or have more of an ego about it. So I think that that's an incredible trait that your dad had. Like, that's just an egoless thing to say and feel about it. I think that that's incredible. So, I found it funny as well. I read in your book how they were working on these Mickey shorts as the Oswald animators were still working in the same office as them. So they would work on Mickey behind closed doors so that these people essentially who had stolen Oswald weren't aware of what was going on with this new creation. It's really funny and incredible to me. Now, your dad, he obviously was a talented artist, but he was a speedy drawer. He could draw things incredibly fast, it sounded like, as far as the amount of, animation he had to pump out in a single day. Was that a skill that you ever saw from him? Or was that kind of, I know this was, before you were born that he was doing this, but did he keep that up at all since his career went in a very different direction?
No, nothing that I would observe. It's all of his history is mostly what I read that others have written, only because he wasn't one to talk about himself. And I could ask him questions and I might get a short answer. There are times when I'd ask him if he would draw me a cartoon after dinner when I was a little kid, and I'd jump up on his lap and he'd sketch out something very quickly. Always fun to do.
That's cool. I like that. Do you have any of those drawings by any chance? Well,
I wish I did, because he got rid of most everything. Again, the way he seemed to operate was that yesterday was yesterday, and he's not going to be bragging about what he's done.
Yeah.
He's more concerned with solving today's problems.
Yeah, and he really, he was working up until the day that he passed away. He was working on Walt Disney World at that point. And I mean, when you have as much on your plate as he did, you kind of have to work that way, right? You can't spend time looking at the past because you don't have time to work toward the future at that point.
Not being an egotist, he wasn't about to spend any time talking about himself. He just didn't.
Did he ever talk to you about the relationship that he had with Walt? And I guess you would have probably seen that as well, because you were working at the studio with your dad, who was working directly with Walt. So, Walt obviously did have an ego, and your dad sounds like did not very much at all. So very different people, but they seemed to work together extraordinarily well.
Well, they did. I think that my dad was interested in coming back to work after he closed up his own studio. A director by the name of Ben Sharpstein was kind of the go-between to start with between Walt and my dad. And I think Ben had mentioned to Walt that Ub had closed up his studio, and would you have any interest in having him come back? And Walt's answer was, well, why don't you look into it? That simple. Have a lunch and kind of test the waters. Well, he did. And when they came back, they met as friends. Walt was astute enough, smart enough to realize that my dad had a lot to contribute if he came back to the company. And what's the point of holding an old grudge about something that happened 10 years before? So it had a lot to do with Walt. And of course, my dad was very open-minded to it. And in their meeting, Walt told my dad, he says, "Oh, why don't you just jump in and see where you can help?" He didn't give him a title, didn't give him a reporting function. He would report to Walt and Walt only. But just jump in and see where you can help. And so that's what he did.
Yeah, now you mentioned, holding a grudge or not holding a grudge rather, but what was it that they basically had artistic differences, right? Walt wanted to kind of control some of your dad's work, and that's kind of what made him separate?
Walt would come in late at night and look through the work that the people have been doing during the day. And my dad noted that he had changed some timing sheets on what he was working on, and it got him kind of upset. He approached Walt about it, and I guess they had a bit of a difference of opinion about it. And I don't know whether Walt apologized, but he would stop doing it for a while. But then I guess that occurred again, and it was really getting my dad upset about it, because my dad was doing the animation and doing the timing, and having someone just step in and do that without working together on it, that didn't go well. And I think he began to see changes happening in the company after Mickey was born, you might say. And I think he got an offer by this guy Winkler, who was going to would finance his own studio. So he made him an offer to set him up. And I guess my dad made the decision at the time that, well, I doubt this is going to change. This looks like a pretty good offer, or probably a very good offer. And they were paying him more, too, than he was making. So he decided to leave. And, Walt was in New York when my dad submitted his resignation to Roy, Walt's brother. And Walt couldn't believe it, and Roy couldn't either. But my dad was pretty emphatic about it, that he was going to leave. So he did.
Yeah, one of the things that you said about Walt being smart enough to recognize that Ub had something to offer to the studio, the more and more I researched Walt Disney, that was I think the greatest skill he had was recognizing what people could do for his studio. Because, the inventions and the things that your dad did, it's the reason that a lot of Walt Disney animated features won Academy Awards and get all of this incredible credit because of stuff your dad invented. One of those things was the multiplane camera, which is, another invention we hear about of your dad's. But the thing that surprised me that I read in the book was that he actually invented this while he was off on his own doing his own films before the Walt Disney stuff.
Yeah.
That's crazy. Yeah. I always think of it, I think most people think of it as like a Walt Disney Studios invention that was made while he was at that studio, but he actually brought it to the studio from his studio.
Right, yes. I think he saw some of my dad's work that was done on his own multiplane camera and figured out what was going on, decided this was pretty good. So he put his own engineer to work to design Disney's multiplane cameras.
Now, when he did return to the studio, as you said, it was 10 years later, he was put on the technical side of things and taken, he wasn't doing animation, because that's where him and Walt, differed in opinion in some cases. So he was put on technical things, which obviously he was extraordinarily good at. But do you happen to know if he missed doing the animation? I guess at that point he was kind of running his own studio, so he was probably doing less animation to begin with. But it's always incredible to me when people have such an insane talent like your dad did drawing, to like just have that stop one day and be like, oh no, now I'm going to go into technical things. So do you happen to know if he ever missed that part of, what he did?
I don't think he did. He was one who could conquer some skill and then move on. And once he's done it, he's done it. And there's no point. So I don't think he would had coming back to Walt Disney Studios he wouldn't have wanted to be an animator anyway. And they must have discussed technical improvements that could be done in their work. So he became a technician, so to speak.
Yeah, one of the things he worked on was photostat prints, which is, when they use those live action models to help the animators. And I guess up until that point, nobody was doing this, but he, in your book, you write so much about, the photocopier machines and the cameras and all this technical stuff that as I was reading it, I was like, okay, you, the author, the son, must have worked very closely, because it's foreign to a person like me who doesn't get how the cameras and such work. But like he was a genius when it came to, he wasn't just working on this stuff. He was inventing it as they went along and
That's
doing
right.
things that are just such a normal part of the process now that it's hard to believe that at one point it didn't exist and somebody had to think it up. So, I mean, that photostat print stuff, it changed animation.
Well, I was familiar with it because when I first went to work at the studio in 1950, I was there for a short time, and I was assigned downstairs in the lab to make photostat prints. So, load the projector with a film and project it onto paper and make the paper prints. So I was very familiar with what it was, what it did, why they were doing it, all of it.
Was this something that, that technical stuff, was that something that you were naturally interested in, or was it from watching your dad, or did your dad encourage you to kind of get into that field? How did you get involved?
No, I think I just absorbed it from him. I like building models. I like creating things with my hands. He had a workshop at home that had metal working tools, had woodworking tools, and he had a dark room. So all of those things were of interest to me. So he continued to encourage me to pursue those fields.
Now, one of the things that I found super interesting was that Walt didn't always obtain the patents for Ub's different inventions because he feared the competition would learn his secrets that way.
Right. That's right.
And because of that, some history is probably lost because of it. Some of it is touched upon in your book because, you realize that, all right, the patent wasn't filed, but this was indeed my dad's invention. And that's kind of crazy to think about.
Well, a patent has big value if you're going to be making thousands and thousands of parts to sell. But if you're going to make a one-off, his multi-head optical printer, as an example, that's how they used for doing their combination work of live action and animation. And it was a different way of doing it. And Walt wasn't about to want to tell the world about that. He'd patent it for what reason. So everybody just keeps quiet about how you're doing it, and then you keep on doing it.
Well, I found that especially interesting because to me, I actually always felt like Walt gave up a lot of his secrets. If you watch like the old Disneyland TV show, he'd always show you like behind the scenes of his attractions and stuff. And I get it. It was a great marketing tool, but I always liken it to a magician doing a magic show for you and then saying, okay, here's how I did all my tricks. And so I felt that Walt kind of was that magician giving away the secrets, but apparently there were some secrets he kept for himself in the studio.
Well, yeah, and then later on, once they had Wet Enterprises going and building things for the parks, they begin to patent various devices. So they have a patent attorney, and I'm sure they still do it to this day.
Yeah. Now, another thing in the film world that your dad worked on was rear projection, which is something that had been used for years, where they, project, whether it's somebody driving in a car and you'll see the movie behind them, and you can always tell it's fake. But your dad figured out or realized that the speed of light was different than the speed of the projector, and that's what was causing flickering and causing it to look fake and all this stuff. I just love that somebody can say, oh, look, this looks fake. Why does it look fake? And your dad's like, speed of light, speed of projector. Figured it out. Let me get to work on it now. I mean, unbelievable.
Yeah, he made up a little device for balancing for that rear projected images that were behind actors. It was always difficult for the photographer, the cinematographer, to get the relative exposures correct. They could expose for the lights on the set, but now they got to adjust the light for the projector. And how do you do that? Well, he reasoned that, when you're standing there looking at this, you're seeing the projected light only half the time, because it has to advance frame to frame to frame, and you're looking at the set full time. So what if he was to design a little viewer that had a shutter in it that's synchronized with the projector shutter? So now it's putting the same flicker over the set that the projector is flickering. In other words, the flickers are coincident with each other. So it balanced it. What it did is it allowed them to balance the light on the foreground set to match the projected image.
Do you feel like you got any of that genetically, like this whole figuring out reasoning of things? Because that's not a normal response, I think, to figure that out. I don't know. It blows my mind. My mind does not work in that way whatsoever. So I'm curious, do you find that your mind works in that way?
Yeah, I think so. But certainly not to the degree his did, but yeah.
Where did he learn so much about lighting and cameras and printers and all of that stuff? Because from what I know, he studied to be an artist. So where did all this come in? Was it just tinkering in the garage, or did he actually study about it somewhere?
No, well, both. He was well read on the subjects, and he did a lot of experimenting himself, but he had a mind that could kind of clear through the clouds of a problem and go right down to what's the problem. First off, is there a problem? And if there's a problem, how could we solve that, and figure out several ways to do it, and then follow it through. And sometimes it would work and sometimes it wouldn't work.
I feel like he was also solving problems for things that people didn't even realize were a problem, like having a quieter camera on set. Now, obviously when they were making silent films, loud cameras weren't an issue, but then when they started making sound pictures, a loud camera, I think people just assumed, well, this is how a camera works. It's going to be this loud. And your dad figured out a way to make it quieter and therefore be able to record audio on set much easier. I mean, that doesn't just change Walt Disney Company history. That changes entertainment history as we know it, which is incredible. Let's talk about Darby O'Gill and the Little People, because this blew my mind when he was figuring out all these optical effects. And, obviously this was long before computers, and they had practical sets with practical actors. And in order for the, working with the distance of the actors to the camera to look convincing, the size differences, they needed extreme lighting to make these practical size effects work. And the city of Burbank, California actually had to get involved in order to make sure it was bright enough in the stage. And that's another thing that, people just don't think about this when you watch movies. But the extraordinary amount of work that went into, they had to get the city to give them enough power to light the stage with enough light. That's crazy.
They brought in portable generators from several of the studios. They rented them, and the city of Burbank gave them all the electrical that they could afford to give them. But the problem on the stage was, first off, the reason they had to have so much light is in order to carry focus from the near objects to the distant people. So that means stopping your lens way down. Well, that means now you're going to be underexposed unless you can raise the light to get the correct exposure. So as you stop down, have to raise the lights. So they brought in these tons of lights, and all up in the ceiling part of the stage. Well, they're generating a lot of heat, and so the Burbank Fire Department and electrical, well, both, but the fire department was concerned too. So that when the temperature up in the attic part of the stage reached about 130 degrees, they would stop production, because I think we're going to have a fire if this goes any higher. And the stage was built with large openings in the ceiling. They could open up and allow the air to go out. So they'd open the stage doors and turn on fans to suck in the cold air to exhaust the heat out of the ceiling. So that was their part of it. But in the very beginning, and I was not part of any of these meetings, but it was probably considerable discussion on how are we going to make little people and real and full-size people look authentic. And I don't know whose idea it was to shoot it all in one take, but that's what they decided to do.
And years later, I believe they used very similar techniques on the Hobbit movies and Lord of the Rings and stuff, which is crazy to think that, with all the technology we have today, we're still working with distance and camera and stuff. And the effect works, is all that comes down to. It worked.
One of the other things that he came up with, the cameraman or director of photography came to him one day and says, we're restricted on being able to pan the camera or tilt the camera, because when we do, the foreground object and the people way out here move relative to each other. How can we solve that? Well, he knew instinctively right away how to solve it. And inside of a lens, as you know, a lens will invert the image to the film. Well, that crossover point where the rays cross inside the lens is called the nodal point. And he said, if we pan the camera on the lens nodal point, not having the lens way out here and panning it from back here, because then it would be sweeping. But if we pan it on the nodal point, they'll stay together. So all of a sudden, he's down at the shop and he says, we got a little project to do. Here's what we got to do. So we adapted a camera so that its nodal point, all the different lenses for that camera were positioned in a way that they would be fixed on the nodal point of the tilt and pan. That solved that problem.
Now, this might be going a little bit too far saying this, but perhaps not, saying that, Ub Iwerks essentially saved animation at the Walt Disney Studios, because one day Roy O. Disney was talking to him and was leaning in a direction of saying, these animated films are costing too much money. We're now in the live action world. We see the return much faster. I think we just need to stop doing the animated movies. And when your dad heard that, he had heard about the Xerox machine and started thinking about, I wonder if Xerox could help in animation and speeding up the process and therefore costing less money. And that's how that started at the Walt Disney Animation Studios. So, in a way, your dad saved Walt Disney Animation.
That's right. He did, because whether Walt would have agreed to it or not, I don't know. But, you can't keep losing money. So Roy might have won that argument. But Dad thought, well, maybe we could just use a little Xerox machine and make our cells that way. And so he did some tests, showed them to Walt. Walt was impressed with it, said, okay, let's go. And so then he built a whole actually 4 corridors in the Ink and Paint building were converted into Xerox camera rooms.
Incredible. Can you talk a little bit about, this Xerox process was used on 101 Dalmatians. I believe it was the first feature to use the Xerox process entirely. And can you talk a little bit about the car chases in that film? Because I thought that this was absolutely brilliant. Since the animators were having trouble animating the car chases, your dad came up with a solution.
Yeah, well, a car is an inanimate object. There's nothing changing on it. It's going to go up and down hills and around bends and so forth. And to be able to animate something like that without having lines on the hood or the windshield or something moving inappropriately. He said, the way to do that is let's build a model of the car out of, it was white cardboard at the time. I don't know whether the styrofoam was around, but they anyway built a model, painted it white, and then painted all of the black lines on it that would be lines. And then they shot it much like that earlier things that we were talking about filming actors and actresses and then making photostats of them. So they photographed it frame by frame, moving the model car around through a little small set. And now they had it. Nothing was going to move. All I had to do was trace over, make photostats and trace over it.
And that kept the size, the correct size, and the angles and everything for the car. That's so funny. You're so they were using stop motion to animate it in a hand-drawn style. Really incredible. So your dad obviously did a ton when it comes to the world of movie making, but he also was very involved with the Disney parks. And the thing that kind of blows my mind here is he was going from some of the most technical, out of this world camera work and all of this stuff for the studio. And then he's brought to Disneyland to figure out some simple things like, lighting effects for the 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea exhibit, to make it seem like there is some water effects, and Sleeping Beauty Castle, some fire effects and stuff. And, these techniques are still used today in a lot of cases. And it's just so funny to me that we went from one extreme to the other, it seems like, but in both cases had such similar results.
Well, they're similar in that he's challenged with a problem, and how could I solve that problem? That flame business in the Sleeping Beauty Castle that was projected onto some little sets. His solution was always look for the simplest way to do it if you can. And so he just took a 1-gallon cider jug and took it to a glass place, had the bottom cut out of it, made an attachment to replace the cap that would hold it and the motor, and it would revolve. And they put a light bulb inside, and then he painted the outside with multi-colors of fire. And the light's projecting this out. It's all soft. There's no lens involved with it. It just produces this very soft, flame-like appearance.
It's really interesting if you take a look at some of the older attractions especially, but even some of the newer ones in the Disney parks. If you're ever in there, like when an attraction breaks down or something and the lights come on and you can see the mechanics of it, in a lot of cases, there's like duct tape holding this stuff together, which is so funny to me because it's a lot of like, well, it doesn't need to be any more complicated than that. So I always think about the hand that crosses on the Haunted Mansion. When you're seeing the grandfather clock and you see the shadow of the hand passing through it. And if you take a look behind you, you can literally see like a cutout of a hand just rotating in front of a bulb. And it's such handmade craft work.
Yeah.
And you'd think these days, oh no, it's got to be like, digital effects and all this. Nope, it's simple stuff. If it works, why change it? In a lot of cases, they don't change it. And one area in the theme parks that your dad, oh my gosh, the work on Circarama and Circle Vision 360, his creation of this technique and the fine tuning of it, it's incredible how far it went, way more than even I realized. We think of them, or at least I think of them, from the Disney parks, but this went to World's Fairs, this went to exhibits all over the world, and I'm always curious, considering how popular it got and how many times the Walt Disney Company was hired to make Circle Vision movies for these different purposes, why didn't some other studio start doing it and becoming a competitor in that field?
Well, we did for the New York World Fair. There was a competitor that made a film for the New York Port Authority.
Okay.
And Disney already had a patent on their camera. They had taken out a patent. But when they went to sue this company to stop them, they actually couldn't stop them. They were able to run the entire 2 years at the fair. But afterward, they tried to stop them from going any further, and the patent office invalidated the patent because they said that solution to a problem was obvious. So the studio I said, no, it's obvious when you think about it, but you got to think about it. So you got to invent it. So you can say anything is obvious if you think about it. So at any rate, they got their patent reinstated, and Circle Vision has been. Circorama was made for the New York World Fair, America the Beautiful, the first one. And then it went from 16 millimeter up to 35 millimeter. And he had one invention in that really cured a problem. It was because the camera were all on a round disc with cameras radiating outward. There was distance between these cameras that someone would get close, wouldn't get photographed. Way out in infinity, it would cross over and make a very clean transition from one screen to another. But up close, you had this gap. And when you saw the film in the theater, anything really close would disappear into the black border because it didn't get photographed. And then a second or two later, it would appear in the next screen. And it always bothered him. And one morning he came into my office and he says, I need a pad and paper. I want to draw something for you. And so he explained what I just said. And he said, the lenses for all these cameras should all be right dead center. But physically, you can't do that. But what if we reflected that lens in a mirror? So the center of the rig is where it ought to be, but the distance to the mirror and down we'll put the lens here. So by reflection, the lens is in the center. And that's what created the camera with all the 45-degree mirrors surrounding it, all the cameras shooting upward. And he said, there's probably once in a lifetime that there's one and only one perfect solution to a problem. And that was it. And they got a patent on that.
I do feel like after reading your book that your dad's favorite tool in his tool chest is mirrors. He used mirrors a lot, and mirrors solved a lot of problems for him. Yeah. And yeah, it was just such a different way of thinking of things. People weren't using them back then, and that's incredible. Absolutely incredible. I loved Walt's vision for Circle Vision that you talk about in the book, and that's where he really wanted to use this to introduce people to their own countries. He wanted these to kind of tour around the world and show people places, even if they lived in that country, places they've never seen before. And he had quite a grand vision for Circle Vision that unfortunately he never lived to see, or even it didn't go as far as he wanted it to. But I thought that was beautiful. I'd never heard that before.
Yeah, well, that was a story that I overheard just watching dailies one afternoon. And Walt came into the theater with a guest and sat near us, and we could hear him talking, and he's explaining to this guest what Circle Vision is. And then he went into this story that we're going to build these theaters all over the world. We'll have the companies pay for them, and we'll be distributing the films. They'll pay for the films, and we'll have a film library that we can circulate around the world from one country to another. And I thought, oh, wow, does this sound good to me? I mean, it was almost like the hair on your arm would stand up, It's just wonderful. But he passed away before that could be implemented. There wasn't anybody want to pick that up and take it farther. So,
yeah. Now, you worked obviously pretty closely with Walt if you were in meetings or at least screenings and stuff like that. And I'm curious, what was it like working with Walt? That's a big question, I know, but is there anything that you feel like people don't hear enough about Walt, or something that we think of Walt that maybe isn't true?
Well, I would characterize Walt as a regular guy, a regular man, not pumped up by his own importance, and he would have a right to be if he wanted to be. But he had an interest in creating something. He was strongly creative. And to be in any kind of a meeting, he's trying to draw out from those people who work for him ideas that they could use in a film or in a theme park attraction. It was just a joy to be around him. And I didn't work that much with him, but I was in a number of times able to be in a situation. One in particular, which I'll always remember, was after we had developed a special projector for the theme parks that would not break film anymore. It would get long film life, because that was a big problem. And we built this prototype projector, and my dad caught Walt one afternoon walking through our shop, said, "Walt, have you got a minute? I want to show you something." And Walt looked at his watch, says, "Well, I got them guessed, but yeah, fine. Let's take a couple of minutes." We went next door where we were running tests on the projector, and it was just Walt, myself, and my dad. And after we entered the room, my dad said, "Don, turn on the projector." So I did, and it started running. And Walt's looking at the projector, and the film was stored in a cabinet in long loops, round and around, 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 and more loops, more loops. Film never was touching itself, so it couldn't get scratched. And we had built a special projector that also would not scratch the film. And Walt looked at it for a while, and he looked at my dad, and he says, "Could this be done in 35 millimeter?" Because this was 16. He says, "Yeah, we could do that." He says, "Could we do circle vision like that?" And my dad said, "Yes, we could." And he looked at me, and he says, "Could your shop get this cabinets built in time for opening of Tomorrowland, 1967? There was going to be a big upgrade then. And this was in 66, about October or something like that, 66.
Wow, so right before he passed, just like 2 months before.
Just a few months before he passed. But what I was going to say is that Walt wasn't one to give accolades out to people who worked for him. On occasionally he would, but he put his hand on my dad's shoulder and said, "Ub, this is real progress," because he could see that we were going to extend our film life from 800 runs per print to 10,000. It wasn't going to require an operator to sit there and read newspaper all day, because you had to have one. It was all automated, ran by himself. The circle vision could run by the host or hostess down in the theater after they talk to the people who've come in the audience. They push a button downstairs, all the projectors start up, run their whole cycle. When they're all through, they're right back to the start. They stop automatically at the right place. They're ready for the next show without any human intervention at all.
It's always so fascinating to me when I talk to people who knew or worked with Walt, and everybody says he was such a regular guy. He was such a regular guy, but he was such a regular guy who clearly had an ego to a point. You didn't get to put your name on everything and get to his stature without having some sort of ego, but it seemed to be such a healthy ego. And I feel like that's a very rare quality, to have an ego yet be an everyman, or a regular guy, as you say, I think is quite an incredible quality.
I think that he was aware that the company was Walt Disney.
Yeah.
That's how it's all being promoted. He could certainly say to somebody that's a good idea or something, but he wouldn't be overly congratulatory to people who worked for him. And that one that I just cited with my dad was an exception to that, because he could see how far reaching that development would go in terms of not having downtime. That's what really used to bother Walt, was when things would break. Now there's downtime. There's a projector missing, and the audience goes by in a cart of some sort or a boat, and they're missing part of the story. And that's why he was so insistent on getting that problem solved.
So from super technical stuff like that to once again making a flickering bulb for Pirates of the Caribbean. They needed a flickering bulb. I guess at that point those didn't exist. So your dad worked on that with once again a simple solution like we were talking about earlier with Sleeping Beauty Castle and 20,000 Leagues.
Yeah, well, he wasn't formally trained in electronics, but he bought some books and started reading, and he designed a little card with some components on it that would make the light flicker unevenly, not it'd be very random, so it'd be like a flame.
Yeah. Now, over at the Haunted Mansion, your dad essentially had a huge part to do with what is considered to be the first projection mapping, which, of course, these days in the parks, projection mapping is everywhere, but he worked on the projection for Leota as well as the busts in the cemetery. And I mean, that's taken on a whole life of its own these days and is still used regularly and is still an impressive part of the Haunted Mansion. It's just so cool. The range of work that your dad did was incredible. And sadly passed away when he was working on the Hall of Presidents, which, was a dream of Walt's that he never got to see. And your dad started to see it, but didn't see it completed, unfortunately. And from the movies to the parks, you can easily say the Walt Disney Company would not be what it is, would not have nearly as many awards as it has if it weren't for your dad, Ub Iwerks. And you know what? You as well, who worked alongside your dad for a very long time. So congratulations and thank you are in order, I would say. It's incredible stuff. But having said that, what is it like working alongside your dad? That's a position that a lot of people I don't think would want to be in. And what was that like for you?
Well, I'd never had any problem with it. In fact, I'd look forward to lunches where we might go off the lot to a coffee shop and have a hamburger and talk over possible solutions to problems. And we did have one machinist in our shop that we assigned to build things for my dad. So my dad could go to this machinist and just say, here's what I want, and give him a little sketch, and he'd do it. It wouldn't have to come through me every time. And they used to joke, this guy used to joke that in the morning he would take what he called his Ub pill, which was something to calm his nerves down a little bit, because he was a little bit prone to getting tense and stressed around my dad. And
That's so funny.
I mean, he's my dad. My goodness, I don't have to feel that way. It's fun to brainstorm with him. I'd put it that way.
Yeah. Now, do you happen to know, does the Walt Disney Studios machine shop still exist? Is that still something?
Yes,
a machine shop? Okay, cool. I wasn't sure if that was something that was outdated at this point, but that's interesting.
Well, it's much reduced. I mean, when we were building Epcot Center, we were over 150 people on 3 shifts to build all of the special projector equipment. But over time, the studio doesn't take on projects like that anymore. So they have a well-equipped machine shop with very talented people in it, but just a handful of people.
Yeah, a lot of that stuff is probably outsourced these days.
Well, they're just taking care of the needs of the studio.
Yeah.
They're not doing web stuff and all that like we used to.
I see. Now, did your dad recognize his phenomenal achievements? I mean, sounds like a pretty humble guy, but do you think he recognized just how much he accomplished?
Oh, he probably would privately, but he wouldn't run around doing this.
Do you know if he preferred a certain area? Did he prefer working in film versus the parks or vice versa? Or was it all just kind of the same for him?
All the same.
Yeah. As long as there was a problem.
Problem solving.
Problem solving, that's right.
Problem solving.
Ub Iwerks, problem solver.
That's what he really enjoyed.
Now, through the years, the Walt Disney Company has paid tribute to your dad in numerous ways. Of course, the highest honor is the Disney Legend Award, which he received posthumously. And he's got, a window on Main Street, USA. His name is in the new, or your name is in the new Mickey and Minnie's Runaway Railway. But I'm curious, is there a favorite tribute for your dad within the company that you love? Let's not include the Disney Legend Award, since that is, quote unquote, the highest honor. But is there another tribute that you really love?
The other thing I could really think of, and it wouldn't be a public tribute, although the studio, and I'm very pleased to see it, that they have come around to telling the story of Mickey as it really happened, as opposed to Walt and Lillian thinking about a mouse on a train trip back from New York. I mean, that made a story, but it wasn't really true. When they hurried back from New York, they had already wired Roy and said, get Ub working on some characters. So my dad had like 4, 5, 6 characters already drawn up by the time Walt got there. And after meetings together with Roy, Walt, and my dad, discussing which one should we go with, they decided on the mouse. It was easier to animate than some of the other characters, and everybody knows what a mouse is. So that's how it all got started. But my point being is that I'm very pleased that the company has recognized that his contribution to that.
When do you think that started? Because like I said, I growing up, I heard the story you talked about with Walt and Lillian on the train. But at some point, I do remember start hearing, the name Ub Iwerks in relation to Mickey Mouse. And I can't remember when that was, but do you happen to know when, or was there an event? Was there a documentary? Was there a book? Was there something that finally recognized the truth?
I think some of it even started outside of the company.
Okay.
The people writing about Mickey Mouse or writing about Walt or about the studio had come to understand that it wasn't Walt all by himself creating Mickey Mouse. They did it together. My dad designed Mickey. Walt was the story man. He's the one who made up the story of what Mickey was going to do, and he was also the voice of Mickey. Mm-hmm. So, in my point of view, they're co-inventors, you might say.
Right behind me here, behind my head. Do you see that picture behind my head?
Yeah,
we've got Walt sitting there in front of a pedestal with a drawing of Mickey. I mean, your dad probably drew that, right?
No, I don't think so. That's probably drawn after my dad left. I would expect that was sometime maybe in the 40s.
Okay.
Well, not in the 40s, maybe in the 30s, sometime in the late 30s.
Okay.
I don't know for sure.
But yeah, it's funny the stories that have been created of Walt and Mickey and the truth. And listen, the truth's always somewhere in the middle. And as you said, the truth is out there now. I think that is a fantastic tribute to your dad. And once again, thank you for the work you've done at the studio. Thank you for writing this book, Walt Disney's Ultimate Inventor, The Genius of Ub Iwerks. It really is a fantastic, thorough book with a lot of Disney history. Even if you know Disney history, there's a lot of stuff in this that will surprise you. It would make a fantastic holiday gift if you're shopping for the holidays, and it is a beautiful, big, full of photos coffee table book. So congratulations. It's a great book, and thank you for everything.
My pleasure. I'm sure glad to get it done. Took a while, a lot of writes and rewrites and so forth, but I finally was very, very pleased with how it all turned out. And I should before we leave, credit to Disney Editions and to Wendy Lefcon and to Jennifer Eastwood. Jennifer was the editor who worked with me on the book. Jeff Curdy was also involved to a degree, and they made it happen. And then icing on the cake was Leonard Maltin agreeing to write a foreword to it, and he did a wonderful job. And I was so pleased that he would agree to do that.
Yeah, it's a fantastic book, and yeah, congratulations. I'm glad you got it done.
Me too.
Now, folks, if you haven't listened to this past Wednesday's episode, be sure and check it out if you've been wondering what it's like visiting Walt Disney World right now during a pandemic. I share all of the details about my recent trip. And don't forget that you can catch the latest Disney news in the House of Mouse headlines every Sunday in this same podcast feed. The easiest way to make sure you don't miss any of the magic is by subscribing to Disney Coast to Coast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Wherever you search, don't forget, it's Disney with a Z, Coast to Coast. And if you didn't hit pause before to go and order your Zelensky Labs face mask, this episode is now ending. So click the link in this episode's description and get on it. And with December sneaking up on us, you'll surely want to take part in this year's last live stream Q&A. Find out how you can take part over at patreon.com/DisneyCTC. That's patreon.com/DisneyCTC. Other than that, folks, have a magical day. Bye!
Thanks for listening to Disney Coast to Coast. Have a magical day.
Disney Coast to Coast is produced and hosted by Jeff DePauli. Learn more about the podcast and become a supporter at DisneyCoastToCoast.com. This podcast is part of the DePodcast Network. Learn more about this show, plus find more quality and entertaining podcasts at DePodcastNetwork.com. That's DEPodcastNetwork.com.